So what exactly is Java's JDBC? JDBC stands for Java Database Connectivity, and is Java's method for connecting to and using various relational database technologies. To elucidate this concept, a relational database is one where fields in one entity or table have a relationship with fields in another entity or table. These relationships take the form of one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. The JDBC acts as an API or application programming interface that defines how Java clients access these databases. A Jdbc-Odbc Bridge connects Java clients to any available ODBC or Open Database Connectivity data source through the JVM or Java Virtual Machine. This data source we're referring to, sometimes referred to as a DSN or data source name, is the path to the database. JDBC connections can be used to create and execute commands in SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language, that insert, update, delete, edit, and query records in a relational or non-relational database. SQL itself is an efficient language with clear syntax and is easily combined with Java code into objects referred to as statements. Let's take just a moment to review some JDBC preliminaries. Before you start programming and creating database projects with JDBC, you must give some thought to how you will set up your programming environment and the host system on which you will be compiling and testing your applications. Also note that in these examples we will be connecting to an MS Access data source, since that is easily available on most Windows systems, yet we can still create JDBC connections and run SQL queries against it as though it were a larger and more sophisticated DBMS or database management system like Oracle. Here are some special notes. If you are using a 32-bit version of Windows, have a 32-bit version of Office installed, and are using a 32-bit Jdk and Jre, connecting to an Access database is fairly painless and trouble-free. If, however, you are using a 64-bit version of Windows and/or 64-bit versions of the Jdk and Jre, you will need to complete some preliminary tasks before you can actually connect to an Access database or create a data source. Depending on the version, architecture, and bit depth of the operating system, the Jdk and Jre in Office, you may encounter issues. When this occurs, you basically have three options. 1. Go completely 64-bit. 2. Go completely 32-bit. Or 3. Go hybrid and combine elements of 32-bit and 64-bit architecture. Let's examine the first option, going completely 64-bit. If you're going to do this, 1. Make sure you're using a 64-bit version of Windows. 2. Make sure you have downloaded, installed, and are using a 64-bit Jdk and Jre. 3. Make sure you have installed and are using a 64-bit version of Office. 4. If necessary, you might need to download the 64-bit Access Database Engine. You can simply Google for it to get it off Microsoft's site. I currently found it here at the link displayed in purple. And you want to download the file, and at this time it was called Access Database Engine _x64exe. 5. Go to Control Panel and then Administrative Tools. Click Data Sources, ODBC. This will open the ODBC Data Source Administrator window. This will access the 64-bit version of the program at C Windows System 32, Jdbc-Ad32exe. Then, go to the System DSN tab and click the Add button. Scroll down and select Microsoft Access Driver, the *.mdb. Go ahead and click Finish. The 7th step, click the Select button and then browse the file system to select your Access MDB file. The 8th step, finally, type a name for your Access MDB database and data source name and a description if desired. Then click OK. Once again, click OK. If choosing method A, that is going completely 64-bit, you are now ready at this point to create a database connection with JDBC. Let's take a look at the second option, going completely 32-bit. To do this, first, make sure you're using a 32-bit version of Windows. Second, make sure you have downloaded, installed, and are using a 32-bit Jdk and Jre. 3. Make sure you have installed and are using a 32-bit version of Office. 4. If necessary, download the 32-bit Access Database Engine. To do this, you can go to the link in purple I've listed here, or if it's changed, simply Google for Access Database Engine.exe. The remaining steps are similar to what we did previously. In other words, 5th, go to Control Panel and Administrative Tools, click Data Sources ODBC, which will open the ODBC Data Source Administrator window. This will access the 32-bit version of the program at C Windows System 32, Jdbc-Odbc 6. Go to the System DSN tab and click the Add button. Scroll down and select the Microsoft Access driver, and then click Finish. 7. Click Select, and then browse the file system to select your Access MDB file. 8. Type a name for your Access MDB database and data source name, and a description if desired. Then click OK, and once again click OK. If choosing method B, that is going completely 32-bit, you are now ready at this point to create a database connection with JDBC. Finally, let's examine the third method, going hybrid and combining 32-bit and 64-bit architectures. This is what I did, so I'll list my steps. 1. I was using a 64-bit version of Windows 7. 2. I downloaded and installed both the 64-bit Jdk and Jre and the 32-bit Jdk and Jre. In other words, all four are installed if I were to click on Programs and Features in Windows 7, and I'm switching between them for different projects. 3. I had installed a 32-bit version of Office 2010. 4. I did not need to download the 32-bit or 64-bit Access Database Engine. The first thing I had to do was assess the bit depth architecture of my operating system. I use Ubuntu 64 and 32-bit, and I use Windows 7 64 and 32-bit. On this development machine that I've set up, it's 64-bit, and I can find that by right-clicking on Computer, and in the properties, I notice that I'm using a 64-bit operating system for Windows 7. So that tells me the operating system. The next thing I had to do was assess the version of Office that I had installed. And in my case, I just have the 32-bit version of Office 2010 installed. After that, I needed to go and see what versions of the Jdk and Jre I had installed. So if I go to Control Panel and Programs and Features, I can look and take a peek and see what kinds of Jdk and Jre versions I have installed. So if you look down here, at first I only had the 64-bit Jdk development kit and the 64-bit Jre, and then later I ended up downloading the 32-bit. So if you need to, depending on, are you going all 64-bit, then you only need 64-bit. Are you going all 32-bit, then you only need 32-bit. Are you doing a hybrid like me? If so, then you need both. You need the 64-bit and the 32-bit versions of the Jre and Jdk. So all of these variables can be different in your development environment, and you have to sort this out really before you start developing JDBC applications. So for my hybrid setup here, I had to go to Oracle's website, formerly Sun Microsystems, and go to their download page, and you want to go to the Java for Developers link. Of course, this may change. They often update and change their website, but I'm sure you can Google these things if you need to. And then the runtime environment here can be found, and also the development kit, the JDK. So if I were to click on download, the Jre comes with the JDK, at least now it does. Notice the different versions I can select. I just check accept license agreement, and if I needed to, depending on if I was on Ubuntu, sometimes I program in Java on Ubuntu, most of the time I use Windows 7, but whatever your platform is, you can select it. And for the 32-bit version, I would choose x86, download that and install it. And for the 64-bit version, I would choose Windows x64 and download that and install it. I installed both. And then, of course, you want to download and install NetBeans, which is their really excellent free integrated development environment, or IDE. It may be necessary, if you don't have the correct drivers installed, to go to Microsoft's website and download either the 32-bit Access Database Engine, which is just accessdatabaseengine.exe, or the 64-bit Access Database Engine, which has the _x64 on the end of it. It was not necessary for me in my setup because of the way I installed Office 2010, but if you try to create a data source name or set up a new DSN and you notice that you don't have the drivers that you need for Access or some other type of database technology, and there's only a few or like no drivers, then you'll want to download one of these files depending on what your architecture is and your operating system. Step 5 is where we really have to do things differently here. Instead of going to Control Panel and Administrative Tools, I ran the 32-bit version of the Data Source Administrator from my 64-bit installation of Windows 7 by going to C, Windows, syswow64, Odbc-Ad32.exe. This is different from the default one in Control Panel. This opened the 32-bit version of the ODBC Data Source Administrator instead of the default 64-bit one, as if I had simply tried to access it via control panel. Note that the access drivers were only in the 32-bit version since I had 32-bit Office. There were no drivers in the 64-bit version accessed to control panel, just two default SQL drivers. So if you click on control panel and you don't see anything there, this will give you an idea of what you might need to do. So if you have a 64-bit version of, in this case, Windows 7, and if you have the 64-bit version of Office, which I don't, I only have the 32-bit version, and if you have the 64-bit version of the Jdk and Jre, then you should be able to click on the Start button, go to Control Panel, Administrative Tools, and click on Data Sources ODBC. And then you'd be able to go to the System DSN tab, and you should see drivers here. If you don't, and everything's 64-bit and you're doing the all 64-bit architecture, then you should be able to download the Access Database Engine 64-bit version and install it. Now here's the deal. If you only have the 32-bit version of Office, it will not let you install it, and that's what you need. So you won't be able to do an all 64-bit architecture. That's why I didn't do all 64-bit. That's why I did hybrid. Notice there's no drivers there. All right, so my architecture being hybrid, this is what I had to do. I can't access the ODBC data source tool through control panel like that because that's the 64-bit version by default because I have the 64-bit version of Windows 7. But I have the 32-bit version of Office, and I'm going to be using the 32-bit version of the Jdk and the Jre as well. So what I have to do is click Start, and I have to use this. All right, instead of the System32, which ironically is the 64-bit version, I have to go to syswow64, which is the 32-bit version. That may seem confusing, but just remember this path down here that I'm highlighting. So if you're like me, or if you're trying to set up a hybrid development environment where you can do 64 and 32-bit, then you'll want to do this. You'll want to set up your DSNs, your data source names, not using the Control Panel Administrative Tools data source ODBC icon because that's 64-bit. Instead, you'll simply want to run C Windows syswow64 ODBC-AD32EXE. And if you want, you could make a shortcut. But notice, when I ran the default 64-bit out of control panel, there was nothing there. But notice now I actually have drivers. Okay, so now I can click on Add, and they're there because I'm using the 32-bit version as opposed to the 64-bit version. And what I would do is I would simply select the Microsoft Access driver, in this case, wildcard.mdb, and click Finish. And then you can type in whatever you want for your data source name. In this case, I'll go Select to set up a data source, and I need to select my directory there. Kind of like almost an old Windows 3.1 or Windows 5 type look there, isn't it? I would go and select, let me see, what am I going to select here? And if I wanted to set up, just as an example, I'll set up a DSN so you can see what that's like. Let me go and select, where did I have that access database? Here, and here, and down here, and here, and here. There we go, right there. Okay, so here is the physical path to my file. And I'm just going to call this one Parts Inventory. Parts Inventory is what I'll call it. Inventory of parts for a description, whatever. Whatever you want to do for this description. Notice this is the path to the file. There's my Access Database file. Here's the data source name. So this is what I'll be connecting to when I create my JDBC code and use my SQL statements. And then I click on OK. So now notice it's there. And at this point I have two DSNs I've added for Access Databases. One's Inventory and one is Parts Inventory. And then finally I would click OK. So again, this is a hybrid environment where I have a combination of things going on. I have a 64-bit operating system, but I only have a 32-bit version of Office, so that limits what I can do. Therefore, I can't simply click on Control Panel and go to Administrative Tools and run the default 64-bit data source ODBC tool. Instead, I have to use the 32-bit ODBC tool, which remember was this: C Windows syswow64 ODBC AD32. Now, I have heard that in Windows 8 they're going to add icons through the control panel and administrative tools. So you'll just simply be able to click on the 32-bit ODBC data source or the 64-bit ODBC data source icons. So it'll probably get a bit easier with Windows 8. But if you're using Windows 7, this is sort of the caveat you want to bear in mind when you're setting up your development environment. 6. I went to the System DSN tab and clicked the Add button. I then scrolled down and selected Microsoft Access Driver. I then clicked Finish. 7. I clicked the Select button and then browsed the file system to select my Access MDB file. 8. I typed a name for my Access MDB database and data source name and a description. I then clicked OK, and once again I clicked OK. Now we're not done yet. If you're going to implement a 32 and 64-bit hybrid architecture, there are additional steps you must take. So step 9. Since I downloaded the 32-bit Jdk and Jre after I installed the 64-bit versions of NetBeans, I had to add the 32-bit Jdk and Jre to my NetBeans configuration as an alternate platform. To do this, I clicked Tools on the NetBeans top menu and selected Java Platforms. I noticed that the 64-bit Jdk was installed at C, Program Files, Java, Jdk 170, and labeled as Jdk 17 default. I then clicked Add Platform and browsed to the location where I installed the 32-bit Jdk. My default location for the 32-bit install was C, Program Files x86, Java, Jdk 170_03. I then clicked Next and named it Jdk 1.732-bit and Finish, so I could tell the difference between the 32-bit and the default 64-bit. Now step 10 is carried out on a project-by-project basis, so it's not global. In other words, I'll do it if I want to compile a project with a 32-bit Jdk and Jre, and I won't do it if I want to compile a project with the default 64-bit Jdk and Jre. For all of these Jdbc examples, I had to use 32-bit. So in step 10, I right-clicked on my database project folder and selected Properties. I went to Libraries under Categories and selected the new 32-bit Jdk 1.732-bit platform I had just added instead of the default 64-bit Jdk 1.7 default in the Java Platform drop-down list or combo box. I then clicked OK, and NetBeans reloaded the project. If you're doing all 32-bit or all 64-bit, you don't really have to perform these extra steps. But if you're setting up a hybrid development environment where you're going to switch back and forth between 32-bit and 64-bit, you'll have to perform some additional steps, both globally and on a per-project basis. So I'm going to open up NetBeans here. And inside of NetBeans, I'm going to go to Tools. And I had to go to Java Platforms. Okay. And I should have waited till it finished looking for updates. There. Okay. So I want to go to Java Platforms. And here's the Java Platform Manager. Now, by default, this was all I had. That was the 64-bit version of the JDK. All right, this did not exist. I had to download this later, the 32-bit version, and then I had to manually install it. So remember, the first time you open this up, if you've started with 64-bit and you're trying to do hybrid, this is all you're going to see. You're just going to see like one platform in there. Well, you just want to add another one. So I had the 64-bit JDK. I downloaded the 32-bit JDK. And then what I did is I clicked on Add Platform. And then I browsed to where that was located. And I'll go up here so you can see the directory structure. But whereas the first one, the default 64-bit, was in the Program Files folder, this one was installed by default in the Program Files x86 in parentheses folder. All right, so it's different. The subdirectory structure is actually different. And so what I did is, matter of fact, I'll just go up one more so you can see. And I'll, in other words, the default one was here, right? This is the normal Program Files, and there's the. Let me go to JDK. So that's the 64-bit version, the one that said default up at the top. That's the only one that existed. Okay, well, the second one that I installed by default, instead of installing it here in Program Files where the 64-bit version installed itself, the 32-bit version installed itself here in Program Files x86. And so I had to go again to Java. And JDK. And then once inside there, that was the 32-bit version, okay? So I just simply selected that, click Next, and then Finish. And then that added it, and I had to name it something different. I just wanted to be able to tell it apart, so you can name it whatever you want, banana, but since this one is 64-bit and it's the default, I called this one 32-bit, so I'll be able to tell the difference. And notice the path structure, right? There's the 32-bit C program files Java. Here's, the 64-bit, and here's the 32-bit, which is C program files x86 Java. All right, so I have two different platforms, 64-bit here and 32-bit here. And then I simply click Close. And now that you have all that set up, you can simply, on a per project basis, decide which JDK you're going to use when you compile things. And so to do that, I'm just going to select the project here and then go down to Properties. Once you do that, if you click on Libraries here, notice you see the Java platform. Well, I can switch back and forth between them now. Up here is the 64-bit. There's JDK 17 default, and if I wanted to compile with the 64-bit JDK, I would use that. But when I'm doing JDBC, because of my configuration of 32-bit Office mixed with 64-bit Windows and the drivers and everything, I need to use the 32-bit Jdk and Jre, not the 64-bit. Otherwise, it just won't work. It won't function. You'll get connection errors and things like that. So to make it compatible, I have to choose this option when I'm doing JDBC projects, and I use this option when I'm doing other projects that are not JDBC. Okay, so that's my configuration. Again, your configuration could be different, but hopefully this will give you an idea of how you could implement or set up a hybrid development environment if you want to do like me and kind of switch back and forth between 64-bit and 32-bit architectures. If you are choosing method C, a hybrid of 32-bit and 64-bit architectures, you should now be ready at this point to create a database connection with JDBC. Whew! All that to figure out, and we haven't even gotten started with one line of code yet. It may take you some time because your operating system, architecture, bit depth, JDK, IDE, software, and data source could be very different from mine. For some configurations, it may come easy, and for others, it may take an act of Congress. But once we get our development environment sorted out one way or the other, we are ready to begin.